Okay, now I have with me guest Alan Mendenhall. Alan, are you online?
I'm here. Hi, Donna.
Awesome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing great. Now, you're calling us from Montgomery?
That's correct. I'm calling from the campus of Faulkner University, which is where our center is located.
Well, let's talk about that. Now, you're the Associate Dean Executive Director of Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty. So, what's this all about?
That's correct. Yeah, the center is located in the law school at Faulkner University Thomas Good Jones School of Law, and we exist to promote the principles of the common law tradition and American constitutionalism. So we're going to coordinate educational programs, research initiatives, and judicial conferences to focus on those aspects of American legal history and the common law tradition that are most treasured to us. So focusing on things like, for example, religious freedom and freedom of association and freedom of speech and economic freedom, freedom of assembly, all these ancient liberties that we inherited from our English ancestors.
Absolutely. Now, talk to us a little bit, Alan, about your background. Very
Okay.
impressive.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I was raised in Atlanta. I studied at Furman University and West Virginia University and Temple University in Philadelphia, and eventually got my doctorate in English from Auburn University. But so deep down, I'm sort of a literature person. But in practice and in my professional life, I'm a lawyer and have been in the legal community. And I've sort of jumped around. I've been in private practice in Atlanta. I've taught at Auburn, at Huntington College, at Faulkner University in the undergraduate, Faulkner University in the law school. I've taught in a prison in Elmore, Alabama. I've taught in Japan and lived in Japan and worked in Japan. So I've been around over the last few years. I moved to Alabama permanently in January 2013. I was a staff attorney for Chief Justice Roy Moore for 3 years. Then I moved to the Alabama Attorney General's office, was an assistant attorney general, worked for Luther Strange, and have now come over to Faulkner to launch this Blackstone Center.
Okay. Give us a little more information about that. I know you're talking about
Sure.
our founding fathers, so talk with us a little bit more about the Center for Law and Liberty.
Sure, yeah. So one thing we want to do is we want to endow chairs here. So we want to bring in nationally, even internationally recognized scholars right here to Montgomery. And we want them to teach courses here in the law school and hold seminars for students and to be sort of public intellectuals in our community and help our legal community and the public writ large start thinking about issues about religious liberty and economic freedom, some of these things that I mentioned earlier. Really, the tradition we represent goes back to sort of the one way of putting it is time out of mind, time immemorial, but articulated in the principles of the Magna Carta in 1215, and then sort of re-articulated through texts like Sir Edward Coke's Institutes of the Laws of England and William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law of England, the English Bill of Rights, and then the American Constitution, and all the sort of cherished and ordered liberties that our forefathers fought and died for, and that we are struggling to preserve today.
Why do you think we're struggling to preserve those liberties?
Well, I think one major element is a lack of education, a lack of civic education, a lack of teaching these principles in school, and I think that rightly or wrongly, our founding fathers have been decried for some of their moral failures over the last few decades of teaching, and that has come at the expense of looking at their successes and their virtues. All human beings are complex people with different motivations, and they're products of their own time and place. And history tends to wax and wane and go through different stages. And it seems as if we're just kind of in an era where we tend to belittle our founding fathers and try to demean them and evacuate them of their importance and their significance and ignore all the great contributions they made to human history, some of the greatest that were ever made. And in fact, the freedom that we have to criticize them, we enjoy because they gave it to us. So I think returning to them and examining what they taught us, looking at the principles of our constitutional system and how we got our constitutional system, will reinvigorate not only the principles but the love of those principles. And I don't ever think it's too late for that. I think all eras of human history eventually get back to them at some point.
I think it always winds up being in full circle. The DeKalb County Technology Center right here in DeKalb County recognizes that. And so they send their students to the nursing homes. And especially when you're talking about agriculture, those folks know more about agriculture than most of us, will ever know. And so It's a chance for the kids to go back and find out the old ways of doing things, and those ways worked.
I agree.
It really, and those are. But what I'm seeing through Donna Fiesel's eyes, that history is definitely changing for politically correctness. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, political correctness is one of those terms that's often hard to pin down. It's like, if you put Jello on the wall or something and try to hammer it down, it's hard to pin down what it means, but. In general, I agree. If by political correctness you mean sort of a form of censorship of particular viewpoints, or even a sort of systematic form of coercion that prevents people from saying what would be either common sense or commonplace, or just making people afraid to speak, if there's a chilling effect on speech based on sort of a regime of acceptable opinion, I think that is the type of political correctness that is ultimately harmful to not only political discourse but to our political institutions.
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head when you mentioned common sense. It seems like we've taken that out of the equation in a lot of ways.
Well, and even scientists who study data about let's say crime rates or science or this or that, when data is considered unacceptable to present, when a scientist is not allowed to offer his or her findings because they may lead to something that may seem unpalatable or against our current our current values, then there's a problem, because data is data. And it ought to be presented and discussed, or else the root problems will never be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Well, why do you think there's been crime since, the beginning of time. With Cain and Abel, there was crime. One murdered the other one. But why do you think it's escalating now? Well,
I think we probably, if we went and we pulled, and I'm no social scientist, I'll preface my answer with that, but I think if we probably went and we looked at social scientists' studies, they probably would show that we have lower crime rates than, we're sort of at historic lows on crime rates. But I think the difference is when crimes happen, they're sort of they're more large scale. I mean, shootings in movie theaters, shootings in malls, terrorists and bombs. And I think a lot of this is significant because these acts of terror and crime are not just violent attacks, which they are, but they're also symbolic attacks. So they strike right at the heart of a free society. I mean, when you look at the West in general, not just the United States, but the West in general, and we've had very open and liberal immigration policies, unprecedented, basically, levels of open borders, and the United States continues to have one of the most liberal border policies in the nation, and in the world. But when you look at something like a terrorist attack and these sorts of things that are occurring in Europe, in Paris and Belgium and elsewhere, that's really attack on that symbolic liberal order that has underpinned Western civilization. That's sort of trying to attack an idea and not just people, but attacking ideas and saying, we're going to force the West to, close up, and we're going to force the West to compromise the principles that the West believes made it great.
I totally agree with you, but does it feel to you that it's our own government that is catering to this?
Well, I would need a particular example of that. I mean, I definitely think the government is responsible in some ways for a lot of social unrest. I think when it comes to things like I'm thinking of different training manuals that have been forced on the military. The military has to use to recognize things like, transgender bathrooms or all kinds of different things that the common soldier is not really having an input in that, and that's coming down from the top of the executive down through the military. It's not even really a military decision. And I think that form of top-down coercion sort of causes some unrest. It causes people not to want to accept the change, and then obviously the people who are inclined to resist the change anyway are not being heard. So that gives a feeling of disenfranchisement that is, I believe, troublesome in the long term.
I think so too, and also social misbehavior, I think, starts with everyone wants to be accepted, and if folks feel like they have to behave a particular way and they feel like they're not being accepted, do you think that also plays into the unrest?
Oh, I definitely think so. I think with both, for example, Donald Trump's presidency and Bernie Sanders' campaign, which is now gone. But I think both of those movements signal a sort of restlessness among the American populace, a certain feeling of powerlessness, and with that, a feeling of anger. People don't feel that we live under representative government anymore. They don't feel as if their voice matters. They don't feel as if politicians listen to them. They feel as if all politicians are beholden to corporate interests or special interest groups, and that the average voter really is powerless in the face of those kinds of entities. And so I think that even people who maybe aren't supporting Donald Trump because of his policies, because sometimes it's hard to say what exactly those may be, but I think part of the reason they may be supporting him is just to kind of say, it's time to stick it to the establishment. We're tired of being bossed around, and we're tired of being coerced. We want to be free, and we want our views to matter to the people we elect.
I have with me right now Alan Mendenhall. He is the Associate Dean, Executive Director of Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty. So just let me ask you this question. Do you think
Sure.
the downfall to society could be when people just don't feel they have the freedom, when they feel like the government is telling them what to do? Is that a downfall?
Well, that's a tall question, because I don't think we're on the brink of downfall yet. I mean, this isn't the collapse of Rome yet. It's not. I don't think we're there, but I think.
But does it point to that?
Well, it's suggestive of a decline. I think it's fair to say that America has lost a lot of its standing in the world. In the World Economic Freedom Index, we continue to drop steadily every year. It's funny, I remember the debates last year when Hillary and Bernie Sanders were debating, and Hillary said something to the effect of, well, Senator Sanders, excuse me, but we're not Denmark, socialism doesn't work. Well, the funny thing about that comment is on the World Economic Freedom Index, Denmark had actually surpassed us. So she was right. We aren't Denmark. We're actually more socialist than Denmark is. So it's, that kind of stuff is should be bothersome to everybody. It really, when you count up the number of deaths under socialism and communism, it just adds up into the tens of millions, and the fact that we still haven't learned our lessons from that. And obviously it's a soft totalitarianism now. It's a slowly creeping totalitarianism. It's not we're not anywhere near where some of the 20th century, early 20th century totalitarian regimes went.
Mm-hmm.
But in some ways it makes it harder to recognize and harder to notice when those forms of government and coercion and tyranny are creeping in slowly and by degrees. It makes it a little bit more acceptable. You give up for freedom here, and it's, well, okay, it was just that, but life goes on. You give up for freedom there, well, okay, it's that, but life goes on. But in the aggregate, when these freedoms start adding up and you start gradually giving away more and more and yielding more and more, and then before you know it, you've lost control. So it's hard to say, where we are on that process, or whether we're even on that process. I don't. Sometimes it's easier to take a long view and just kind of say, well, we'll let history determine, hundreds of years from now where exactly we are in the process. But in my personal opinion, I feel as if we're not moving in a good direction, and I think common sense, which we talked about earlier, bears that out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. How important do you think it is for students to feel they can be winners, they can be successful in life, and not be given the same trophy?
Well, I think that's important. I think being successful in life is always important. I think we've got a lot of barriers that we're putting up for our future generation. We're under trillions of dollars of debt, and we're just leaving that for the next generations. And Social Security is obviously on an unsustainable path, and something will have to be done about it at some point, because it just cannot continue the way it's continuing. And so, I feel bad for. I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, so I'm quite frankly frightened for what they're going to have to grow up and see, and have to deal with. They're going to have it's going to be a uphill battle, to be sure. I mean, federal loans have caused colleges, actually have incentivized colleges to raise tuition increasingly over the years, and it's to a point now where tuition for college, just basic college education, is unaffordable to most people, and it's sort of a vicious cycle, and it forces people to take out more loans, and the more tuition that gets paid through loans, the more the universities are going to continue to hike up tuition rates. It's also an unsustainable system that is going to have to get worked out. I'm not sure how it's going to. I don't know the answers to that kind of stuff, but I can sort of tell you the problems, but not really provide you the answers to those.
Well, you know what? We're going to have to cut to a break in less than 2 minutes, but there's some good news around the horizon, and you guys are going to manifest that with Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty. And I'm very glad to be talking with you. I'm speaking with Alan Mendenhall. He's the Associate Dean Executive Director of Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty. And I really like what you have to say about what's happening, but there's a way out. I mean, there's been times through American history that we could have been done in, and we were not. That's the thing about us. We have the spirit, and sometimes it seems to be downtrodden, but we always make it through. So just hang around a little bit less than a minute. Listen to us online at 1400WFPA.com. That's 1400WonderfulFortPayneAlabama.com. Alan, did you know that's what it meant? 1400 WFPA. Well, I don't think we just kind of took that slogan on with us. You can give us a call if you have any questions at 256-845-7721. You can also send a text our way to 256-659-4319. We'll be glad to listen to and read your text online. Again, I have with me right now Alan Mendenhall. He's the Associate Dean, Executive Director of Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty, Jones School of Law. And I have another question. It seems like, and you touched on this, history, as far as what the kids are being taught, is being changed. And do you think all the points, with all the things that are happening in the world, even the world and the United States, could that point to our history changing?
Well, I think I think we've seen our history change already. And, as our country gets older and we have more periods to explain and to understand, we'll have more distance from eras such as the founding or the Civil War, and different understandings of Jacksonian democracy as we get farther away from those eras. I think it's inevitable that the way history gets told will change. Now, what is, in my view, troubling is sort of I consider it to be an anti-intellectual move to try to demonize or villainize people from the past simply for being, for existing in a time and place in which they existed. When you are plugged into your own moment in history, you cannot know what it is like to think outside of that moment in history. I cannot think like a person 300, 400 years from now will think, nor can I think like, some medieval monk would have thought. So there is a dangerous tendency to dehumanize and simplify our forebears, our ancestors, and that's a dangerous precedent to set in light of the fact that we will also be judged by the future as well. So do we want to set up impossible standards for ourselves by which we will be measured one day? I don't think so. I personally would like us to do history where we are, analyzing the nuances and complexities of individuals, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, figuring out what's useful and good from past eras and from past people, and finding out, what things maybe aren't so good. I mean, and trying to figure out, well, if they weren't so good, how do we reconcile the views of, what was good with what was not good? I mean, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is an amazing statement of liberty and equality, and it still resonates today. And yet, Thomas Jefferson, owned slaves. I mean, he was a complex man, and I think treating him as a complex man and an actual flesh and blood human being, rather than just a character that is not real to us, is unfortunate. I think we ought to look at Jefferson for his accomplishments and for all the greatness that he did give us, and for all the freedoms and liberties that he taught us to enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Well, my son came in from school one day, and he was a little upset, and he said he was upset with our family. And I said, well, why are you upset with the family? And he said, because our family had slaves. And I said, no, I don't think we did. I said, let's go ahead and call my grandmother. So we called my grandmother, and she'd already told me the story, so I knew what she was going to say. And I let her talk with him. And she said, no, son, our family never had slaves. She said, not every white person had slaves. And as a matter of fact, she says, we worked out in the fields with the slaves. And so that's just, that's another thing that's being taught in history that's just absolutely not true. And his other grandmother, the family there did have slaves. They were the Culpepers from South Carolina. And I heard her talk about the slaves they had, and, that she had been told about. And they couldn't get them to leave. They had liberties. They could leave. They were free, and they just wouldn't do it because they really enjoyed working there. So not every slave owner beat slaves.
Well, I think the example you provide is a good example of what's problematic about trying to universalize historical experience, and to try to say, this is how things were way back when, or things were like this, or things were like this. I think people, when they start digging into primary texts and looking at history and reading it really studiously, they find that, first of all, historical figures are in a lot of ways frighteningly recognizable. We could see a lot of ourselves in them and sort of identify them. But a lot of the contingencies and systems and structures that were in place through no fault of the people living at that time necessarily, things that they inherited that may be more problematic, are things that these people are wrestling with. And some of it they're so immersed in it that they almost can't tell. I'm sure there are things that we're immersed in right now that that one day history will probably judge us on, and we're so immersed in them we don't really know what it is. It would be silly to try to come up with examples because you couldn't. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, circumstances and conditions differ from time to time and place to place, and especially within the United States history, where we have such a tension between the principles articulated, say, in our Bill of Rights and in the Declaration of Independence, and some of the institutions such as slavery that existed. There's such a tension there that we feel that we have to reconcile. How could we extol the one and permit the other? How does that work? And these are questions that it's hard to find answers to, and people dedicate their entire lives to trying to figure out the answers to those questions, and they push us a little bit long. They contribute a little bit more to the sum of knowledge, but sometimes those answers evade us. So I think teaching history as always like a simple black or white moral lesson is not necessarily constructive. I think it can force us to avoid some of the nuances and complexities that are actually where we will find more understanding when we look at than some of the sort of clear-cut, more obvious issues.
I totally agree with you. And using this for an example, my granddad was a farmer, and I've heard him tell the story about the first time he had a farm. And he said he was planting his garden, and he was planting, grew seeds, tomato seeds. And he said, the first year, he said, I didn't have many tomatoes. He said, I had to learn from that. And he said, when I found out, he asked his grandfather. He said, you have many more tomatoes than I do, so what did you do different than I did? And he said, well, what you do, you tear the leaves off where you're showing just one leaf. So it gives you a better root system, and then you plant it all the way down. It looks as if you've killed it, but you haven't. And what's happening is that tomato plant is down in the ground, and so it's going to develop a real good root system because you're not going to have all the heavy leaves. If you leave all the leaves on there, the plant is going to get heavy, and the tomatoes will get heavy, and it'll die. So he was talking in essence of pruning the plant. So that was something he brought down to me. So we have a lot of tomatoes every year based on history, and my granddad not being too over the top to ask his grandfather how he raised tomatoes. So it's important to go through history. It's important. My granddad taught me that, he said the first crop was not a good one. He said, but I had to go back and ask my grandfather why his were so much better than mine. So that's why history is so important. And we have about 2 minutes.
It's like a living metaphor. I think that's great. I love that.
You can take that with you on everything in business, whatever you do in life. Just think about the tomato. Think about the tomato plant. Alan, it's great having you on the show, and you got a couple of minutes left. Let's talk about again the Jones School of Law, Blackstone Center, Law and Liberty, and then more information about that, how folks can get enrolled.
Well, we are brand new, so we haven't even launched our website yet. That is forthcoming. But one event that we have coming up is October 13th. It's 5:30 to 7:30 in the Rotunda of the Alabama Supreme Court, and it is a traveling Magna Carta exhibit. We are co-hosting it with the Library of Congress and the National Federalist Society, and the exhibit itself will be in the Rotunda of the Alabama Supreme Court for 3 weeks, so people can just go in and tour it and look at it. I mean, it's a big exhibit. It takes up that Rotunda. But on the evening of the 13th, 5:30 to 7:30, Judge Bill Pryor from the 11th Circuit will be there. He'll be giving a few brief remarks. Justice Lynn Stewart from the Alabama Supreme Court will be there. She'll be introducing Judge Pryor. And it'll be sort of just an evening of commemorating the Magna Carta and the ancient liberties that have been passed down to us through that. and I think it will be an exciting time.
That sounds like an awesome event. Can you send information to me about that?
Sure, I
And
would
I'll
be
get the
happy
word
to.
out for you. Be glad to.
I
You
would
have
be
my
happy
email
to.
address. Thank you so much, Alan, for being on the show. This is Alan Mendenhall. He's the Associate Dean Executive Director of Blackstone Center for Law and Liberty. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Donna. You have a good night. Enjoyed the debates tonight.
Thank you.